theologically and biblically, at least studies-wise, there's been co-opting. And some cultural perspectives become dominant as if it's the original. And I'm not saying that's just the case with European stuff. I'm just saying in general. So I would advise folks like, yo, read early church Christians. Read them. You will see they think very differently than a bunch of us. And you'll be surprised that a lot of them come from Northern Africa. You'll be surprised that a lot of them come from Asia Minor. You'll be surprised that a lot of them don't come from Europe. And it's no shot to Europeans at all. But church history is too broad for us to reduce it to just one slice of the pie. But yeah, read the Apostolic Fathers. Read the folks who were like Athanasius. Dude was called the Black Dwarf. I'm like, does that mean he was chocolate? I'm assuming so. Dude's from Africa. He could be browner skin. And again, I'm not trying to elevate one's pigmentation in skin, but I'm just saying the church historically is multi-ethnic and multicultural. It's just what it is.
Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, podcast listeners of all ages and stages, welcome, bienvenue to episode 78 of the Jolly Thoughts podcast. And hey, if you happen to be watching the video version, Happy New Year! Yay! It's not quite the New Year, probably, or maybe it is. I have no idea when you're listening. I also am just screwing around with that stuff that you can do on the, IMAX or whatever, so you can do those reactions. Like right now, for example, there's a bunch of balloons going for no good reason right up my screen. It's a wild and wacky time. Anyway, for those of you who are listening to audio, this is complete and utter nonsense. But the reason I, subjected you to that is because this is the last episode of 2024. And I don't do seasons because, first of all, I don't have time for that. And obviously, these just kind of come in waves. Whenever we happen to have one, we put it out. Whenever we don't, we don't. So had a little bit of a spate here at the end of 2024, which has been fun. And we do have some fresh episodes looking ahead for 2025, more about, music, more about theology, and some about parapsychology, one of those kind of fun ones. So yeah, some more stuff down the chute. But as I reflect back on 2024, I just can't believe all that has happened, all that's transpired. And I just really, truly am grateful. I'm grateful to God for the way that He has provided, protected, and guided me over the last year. And I just hope that you also experience some of that gratitude, even though maybe your story was also, full of some rougher things too. Maybe you experienced loss, maybe you experienced some heartache, or maybe you just don't quite see that end of provision behind you. It is my hope and prayer that in 2025, your eyes will be opened to see God's goodness for you. This story and conversation that I'm sharing with you today is in fact largely a story, and it is a story of a man named Hakeem Bradley, who now we introduce who he is in the podcast, so I won't spend too much time doing that here. But I will just say that to me, this is apropos for a New Year's episode, because his story certainly was one of hope, but it being revealed in the fullness of time, and him being able to look back and seeing how God was always there with him. And I love how in the conversation we have these kind of various people that we kind of call catalysts or whatever, people who kind of help him take the next step in his journey. And it was cool. It was just a great chance to kind of take a look back and see how God worked in his life. Very interesting cat. You're really going to like this conversation. I can almost guarantee you. And if not, you know what? Hey, your money back. All right, sound good? Without any further ado, then, my conversation with Hakeem Bradley. I lived in Vancouver for a year, so okay. I know the West Coast vibe is definitely a lot different than that East Coast.
Indeed.
The air feels different out there than it does out here.
And it rains all the time over there.
True. Yep.
So I said, we got to get up out of here, babe. Let's go.
Let's go somewhere else.
Indeed.
Cool. Hey, Hakeem. So the reason that we're chatting is because you were in the neck of the woods, which I currently occupy, out in Moncton, New Brunswick, Canada.
Yep.
Which was cool. And you were out here for the Youth Workers Convention. I don't even know. It was in November, so a little over a month ago.
Yeah.
And you were able to share. You shared with a lot of youth workers. I'm not a youth worker, so I didn't get a chance to hear a lot of the backstory. I was just there leading worship as for the kind of main rally event, and you shared that night, and just like the teasers kind of in and out of your story, I was like, oh dang, I feel like there is some untapped maple syrup somewhere in that story that I would like to taste a little bit more. And so I was like,
Canada.
hey man,
come on.
Like all the references. Pecan, I put some pecans on top, but we'll go Georgia.
Yes, sir.
So we lined this up. So I honestly know kind of like woefully little about your story, really. I just know a little bit. And so this is really genuinely just an opportunity to chat, get to know a little bit about kind of where you are. So we already know that right now you're in Georgia, and you mentioned that before that you were living in Portland, and then before that you grew up in Philadelphia. Can we start and you can be selective in how you roll through this, but let's start at the beginning, shall we? So you grew up in Philadelphia in what kind of context?
Yeah, so just to give as much context without taking too much time, I grew up in a predominantly Black space, and my parents were not married. My mother was a teenage parent, and my father was just a couple years older than her. And so I found myself being birthed into this environment, and I grew up relatively lower class income-wise, like socioeconomically. I didn't grow up in the church by any means. I actually grew up in a religious movement called the 5% Nation, which has a lot of hostility towards the faith that I have currently in Christ. And so that's the gist. My family's kind of shattered all over, but nonetheless, we love each other deeply. But I think we've all kind of just encountered not only brokenness within our family, but brokenness in our respective neighborhoods and communities. So I grew up seeing a lot of violence, participated in different forms of violence, especially fighting growing up. And that was the kind of origin story of Hakeem in Philadelphia. But I grew up with parents who loved me deeply, with a bunch of siblings that I have solid relationships with and deep love for, an extended family that I'm grateful for as well. So that's the skinny of it, you know?
Yeah. Okay. So let's dig in a little bit. So
come on.
What's the 5% Nation? Like how much can you give us about that? I looked it up on Wikipedia and I was like, well, I'm going to talk to a guy who probably could do better than Wikipedia. So
so it's an offshoot of what is the Nation of Islam. If you're familiar with Malcolm X, he was a big figure, Elijah Muhammad. The founder of it, his name is Clarence 13X. And Clarence, I don't want to misrepresent him, but I would summarize and say, he's like, oh, you guys aren't taking it far enough. The Black man is actually Allah incarnate. Like the Black man is God, so to speak. And Black women are like earths. And so gods and earths, which is another name for the movement, is the nation of gods and earths. And so together we create all that is. And we are the original peoples of the land. There was a mad scientist named Yakub who did this weird, like, evil experimentation that did some DNA deprogramming that ultimately led to the different races and ethnicities being formed out of Black people. And the worst of them all are white folks. And so that's the movement. But a lot of that was in reaction to the civil rights era. And you kind of draw this super strong Black identity, and you're trying to hold on to that in light of the racial climate that was in the 1950s and 60s. And so there's 5% of the world's population that know the truth about Black people, and particularly the Black man. There's 10% of the world's population that are the quote unquote elites, and they know the truth about the Black man, but they are trying to prevent the 85% from knowing. And so it's the responsibility of the 5% to give the 85% the knowledge so that all is well. That's kind of like trying to give as best as I can of a summary, but also Wikipedia is an interesting page, so to speak.
Yeah, sure. So like, cause Wikipedia can't tell you, like, it didn't grow up in it.
It didn't live it. Yeah.
So like, you did until you were roughly, we're going to get to a conversion story, and I actually don't know where this happens in a conversion story. So now, teenage Hakeem, did you believe this?
I would say by the time I was a teenager, I was very uncomfortable with what I was taught. And so I would say mentally I was removed from this belief system and this practice. And there's kind of like an Islamic bent to it.
Mhm.
And so you pray to Allah, all of these things. And there's some of that you get from the Nation of Islam traditions. Uh, but when I was a child, it was what I grew up in. And so I didn't really have a choice. And they have the supreme alphabet. So each letter in the alphabet is 26, represents something. And I believe A represents Allah. And I forget about the rest. But then there's the supreme mathematics, which, depending on who you talk to, can go from 0 to 9 or from 1 to 9. And each of those numbers represents something. So like 7 represents God. I always get confused if number 1 or 3 represents knowledge and understanding, but it's these not ethereal, but kind of just these wisdom tenets that everybody's trying to ascribe to. And you recite the supreme mathematics every day. And each day you ask, what's today's mathematics? And depending upon the date, so today is the 18th, you would say, oh, today is the day of such and such and such and such. That corresponds to 1 and 8.
Oh, wow.
So it's a whole lot, but I would recite that every day as a child with my dad. But yeah, by the time I became a teenager, I was like, I'm good.
So this is like, some people grew up in my neck of the woods. Catholicism is at least was a very, very big thing when I was a kid. And, it's definitely dropped off. But there's a lot of people who grow up Catholic, but have no like similar trajectory in some respects. By the time they're teenagers, they check out. And then by the time they're adults, they're like, oh yeah, there's something about a host. And I have my first, my first communion. I can't remember what that's called. All these things become kind of dim memories, but then you kind of drop them back in a Catholic service and they might remember when to stand and when not to stand because it's kind of muscle memory. Because like that's an actual lived experience for people who were active. I always ask people, I'm like, were you a active Catholic or were you a passive Catholic? Sounds like probably not a lot of people were passive 5%ers. Is that right? Like, would you were there many people who were like, oh, I'm this, but in name only? Like, were most people actually living this kind of stuff on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, I would say so for the most part. I would say so. That's my guess. At least the folks I was around, these are things that they held to pretty tightly.
And it's a deeply evangelical, it's a very missional, evangelical in the sense of, maybe I'll use the word evangelistic. It sounds like it's a very missional faith, right? So like your job is to go out. You are one of the elect and your job is to go and convince as many of the non-elect about an apocalyptic unveiling of how the world actually is, right? Like we have this knowledge and we must bring this. So like anybody who's spending time in Christian circles will immediately see the parallels to how we're intended to live, whether or not we kind of do or not is dependent upon whether you're an active Catholic or a passive Catholic or active evangelical or a passive evangelical. But
I like that correlation. I never thought of it like that. And it's true. And I think foundationally the hope was, can I have the knowledge of self? It was really about, foundationally, it's about making sure Black people know who they are and that they can be proud of who they are. And so I respect the desire to uplift culture, ethnic group, and all of that. But I'm not okay, and I say this confidently, I'm not okay with calling other people groups evil. Foundation, say, no, they're evil. They're not us, they're evil. And I know there are a lot of ideologies out there in the world that kind of talk about this type of thing, but that's one of the things that made me uncomfortable growing up. And I was like, nah, I can't, and I don't feel comfortable calling myself God. I'm a God? I don't think so. Not based on what I understood as a God at that time, and I had no roots of any. Even though there was a Abrahamic like faith bent with Islam, I still had no recollection of any Abrahamic faith, whether that's Judaism, Islam, and Sunni or Shiite traditions, or Christianity and all of its traditions. I had no idea, but I knew I'm not okay calling myself a God. So that was a starting point.
Did you know many non-Black people?
Oh, that's a good question, Mark. I would say I had a couple friends who were either Puerto Rican, but they are also part of the African diaspora. So you
Is that
have
how
that.
it's interpreted? Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So you have that. And then there was a couple white folks that I went to school with, a couple of Asians I went to school with, mainly in middle school. When I was in elementary school, all of my classmates were black. And we had a few white teachers, but we had one indigenous teacher, a few white teachers, but most of the staff was black. And so that's really all I grew up around primarily.
Right.
Until I got to middle school. And then I moved to Portland, which is a totally different world than Philadelphia.
Yes. More white people for sure. At least
Significantly.
now, but I
Yeah.
don't know. I don't know what it was like that at that point in time, but
Yeah.
yeah, because I mean, like the trajectory that often happens to people. I mean, I'm thinking the way that I tend to think about this is more like in terms of how people think about sexuality. So it's not a good, probably it's not gonna be a perfect analogy, but often people end up having these pretty, I'll say closed, specific expectations of how sexuality ought to be
Sure.
until they make friends with somebody who happens to have a different experience than them. And then they go and they end up having some sort of a crisis of,
Sure.
well, this isn't what I thought. And then they end up wrestling through this and
Sure.
ends up in different ways. And that's immediately what I thought of when you're thinking, if you're convinced that your race is the best race, for lack of better words, and then all this, and that not just the best race, but the other races are, like you said, kind of inherently evil. And then all of a sudden you make friends with somebody who is quote unquote inherently evil. Then you're like, oh, I got a problem here. Like, how am I going to reconcile this?
Yeah.
Do you think that did, in some respects, contribute to, like, what do you think were the frayed bits of the rope that started to unravel for you?
Man, that's a good question. Outside of being uncomfortable with the idea of calling myself a god, I just couldn't get around that. You're telling me that white people are devils. I understand there's some historical things that have happened in America that are horrific. Granted. But I just don't feel comfortable saying that. And I encounter some of these teachers of mine in elementary school who care deeply for me, who allow me to develop intellectually, emotionally, mentally, spiritually. In this elementary school, I'm asking questions, I'm trying to figure out who I am. I'm a young kid, and they supported me in ways that I'm like, there's no way they can be inherently evil. That doesn't make sense to me. This is a devil? If this is what devils are, then I'm hanging around. Like, what's... So yeah, there's a teacher in particular. Her name is Mrs. McLaughlin, one of the most foundational people in my life. 4th and 5th grade teacher. When I tell you this woman was not afraid to knock down boundaries that we may have had, like, we're culturally different, we're socioeconomically different. You come from a 2-parent household, a lot of us kids don't. You come from a middle-class space, a lot of us kids do not at all. You don't live in the city proper, but you come to the city proper all the time to make sure that we're educated. And having somebody like that in my life kind of just gave me a vision of, yo, there's something off. There is a way of life, and there is a way of interacting with one another that shows that we can cross those boundary lines and actually be unified in a way. So Mrs. McLaughlin was very foundational for me, going like, all right, this still just don't feel good. And I don't know what to do with that. I don't know where to go, but that was there.
Shout out to Mrs. McLaughlin and to
real.
all those elementary school teachers out there who are slogging it.
Seriously, man.
Yeah. My wife is an elementary school teacher, so I get it.
Come on.
Yeah.
Come on.
She's much holier than I am. So then why the move to Portland?
Yeah, so I was going into the 8th grade. Philadelphia is just, I don't want to paint the whole city a certain way, but there are a lot of violent climates in that space, in that city. And so my mom's father and his wife and some extended relatives lived out in Portland already. After my mom's parents divorced like 30, 40 plus years ago, or how old am I? Yep, about 30 something years ago. And they moved to the West Coast. And so my grandfather was like, why don't you come on out here, bring the boys. My mom is a parent to myself and one of my half siblings, and then the rest are from my dad. And I have two stepsisters. My grandfather was like, yo, y'all should come move out here. It'll be a good opportunity for the boys to have a new environment, give them some different opportunities. And my mom just took a risk. And at first I was like, Mom, this is a terrible idea. I've been to Portland to visit twice, when I was 7 and then when I was 11. And I was like, Mom, it's horrible. It's boring out there. Ain't much. We don't know nobody. We don't got no money. You ain't got a job. Like, why would we go out here? And thank God she didn't listen to her teenage son. And said, nah, I'm going to take this risk. Mind you, the first year we were there, we were technically houseless. My grandparents invited us to live out there. The goal was to move into their house as they were renting it out. But they were still living in Chicago at the time to help care for my step-grandmother's mother. And they were still living out there and doing their whole thing. So by the time we got out to Portland, they haven't returned yet. And so we're like, where are we going to go? Then we had some family conflicts with some extended relatives and trying to stay with them. Relationships shattered. It was a horrific year, first year. My mom was still unemployed. Thank God, at the end of my 8th grade school year, she finally got employed at the state hospital. And we were allowed to move out to one of the suburbs in Portland. And that kind of really just birthed a transition for my entire life. Not only mine, but my mom's and my younger brothers. It changed everything. Everything, Mark. And so thank God. When I say thank God my mom didn't listen to her teenage son, I have no idea where I would be if she did. Not that she was responsible to, or not that she had to, but I'm glad she did do what she thought was best.
So when you say change things, what kinds of things did it change?
Oh, man. What did it not change? I met people, I made friends that showed me that the world is a lot bigger than what Philadelphia provided. I had friends who were from different socioeconomic statuses that were like, yo, let me show you what it's like to not have to worry about having a meal missed from the day. Let me show you what it's like to feel safe in an environment and not have to constantly look over your shoulders to make sure nobody is potentially going to harm you. Let me show you what it's like of what a healthy family can look like. I had different friends in different pockets from different backgrounds in this suburb. But I saw a different side of life that I'm like, yo, it's possible to have a healthy family. It's possible to not be in poverty. It's possible to find a way of life that really leads to peace and joy, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, self-control. And you know where I'm going with this. There's really a way of life, and it's in that environment that I found Jesus. So that's what I mean by it changed the course of my life.
Wow. Your mom, I think you implied earlier that your dad was more of the kind of active participant when it came to your kind of previous religion. Yeah. Your mom sort of was just kind of going along for the ride, or was she a true believer too?
It's a good question. Sometimes I don't know. I think she would, because she was young and impressionable. I think she bought on and she held to some of the wisdom tenets that the faith was giving her. But she grew up in the church. Dad was a pastor, mom sang in the church, all of that.
Oh, come on.
And so when my parents split, I was around 5 and she just returned to her roots. So she's been trying to figure it out. So I remember being a kid prior to moving to Portland and going to church with my mom. But again, I was like, this is weird. What are they singing about? Who is this Jesus dude? I grew up peripheral to Christianity, meaning my mom's side of the family were all Christians. I had a couple folks on my dad's side that were Christians, but I mainly grew up in an Islamic or 5% type of environment. And so, my mom bought into a couple things, but once she and my dad split, she just returned to her roots. And it wasn't hostility for me to come to Jesus when it came to her.
Oh, good. So, that kind of paves the way. So you mentioned, if I'm tracking correctly, your mother's father was a pastor?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And so what denominational or kind of strain did he pastor in?
They were some Pentecostals, for sure.
Okay. All right. And so that's good. And so did the breakdown of his marriage kind of put a bit of a kibosh to that, or was that just part of this broader story? Or
yeah. I think because I wasn't born yet when they split. I was born 2 years after about when my grandparents split. And when they broke up, it kind of just sent all of their kids on a downward spiral. My aunt responded one way, uncle responded another. And then my mom met my dad during that time. And as a teenager, she's just figuring out how to navigate post-divorce. So with that, I think my grandfather moved to California and still was doing ministry type of stuff. But all of my memory is kind of funky on that because I wasn't around too much. Even when I was born and then when I was in my early childhood, I never went out to California to visit. So I don't know what life in California was like for him at all. But I assume he stayed in ministry context until his like mid-50s, I want to say. That's my guess.
You know, I mean, this is a random question, but it's one that suddenly occurs to me. Are there comparatives in Islam to Pentecostalism? Like within, like, is there like, Pentecostalism is to Christianity as this is to Islam. So I know that like there are mystical traditions within Islam, but I don't know of there being any quote unquote kind of charismatic traditions within Islam.
That's a good question. I do not know. That's like, a good question.
I'm trying to think because like, well, you're in one religious tradition. What's another religious tradition? Like, as you kind of implied, it felt like you were kind of on the outs when you went like, hey, what's going on here? I understand. But I mean, if you went and visited, like a Lutheran church, and it'd be a whole different thing if you went and visited like a Vineyard church, right? Like you would just have like a wildly different kind of experience based upon that. So was your experience like, I don't know what's going on here? Or was your experience like, I think these folks are kind of weird? Like, how did you connect with the kind of experience of going to visit these kind of churches when you were a young man?
Yeah, I mean, I just found it odd because they would sing like these hymns, and I'm like, this sounds old. And at the time, all I listened to was hip hop and R&B. So I'm like, if it's not Jay-Z, DMX, Nas, Ashanti, or whoever, I'm like, what are we talking about here? If I can't dance to it, it's gonna make me not want to be here. But like then you had traditional like black gospel music being played at the same time, and you get your clap on in situation. But I didn't know church culture. And so it just felt weird. And they would pray to God, but then they would also pray to Jesus. And I'm like, so is Jesus God? Isn't Jesus a human? But then you're also calling on the Spirit of God. So I'm like, what is going on? Why are there multiple people that you're talking about?
This is the common slag that Muslims tend to lobby against Christians. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. So I'm like, are you praying to God, or if Jesus is God, why is he praying to God in this text that you're reading? Like and then, at that time I was listening to pastors preach, but I couldn't understand half the things they were saying because there's a cadence that they would have where they're hooping. That's what some folks would call it in black church traditions. And it's like you extend certain words and you have you do all of that. You had a cadence. And I'm like, this is distracting. I don't know what's going on. And so, I just had no foundation for the text that they were talking about.
Sure.
And I had no foundation for the theology or just the Christian cultures that I got to plop in. So it intrigued me, though. I said, okay, I don't understand it, but
ultimately it was people. It sounds like it was people that you got to know that were more the apologetic. It wasn't as though like you were in a service one day and you just felt something. It was like, oh, I need to find out more about this. It was through your experience of getting to know certain people who, as you kind of alluded to, they seemed to carry the Spirit of God with them in a way that you found attractive and you wanted to know. So what do you think was ultimately kind of that linchpin or decisive moment for you?
Yeah, it was a man named Phil Zahn. Phil was a young life leader in the greater Portland area, or the suburb area where I was at. So the west side of Portland. And he approached me at a soccer game. He's like, what's up, bro? My name's Phil, blah, 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 blah. I'm like, man, that's cool, bro. Like, what you want? And he's like, man, I work for Young Life. I'd love to invite you to a Monday night. I'm like, okay, I've been hearing about this Young Life thing. Like, where is it at? And so we exchanged numbers, and I ended up going the following Monday. And lo and behold, I walk in. It's hosted at a basketball teammate of mine's house. And I was like, oh, wait, what? where was it? And it was up the street from my apartment. So I'm like, how have I not heard about this entire time? And again, I look around and it's all my friends. And I'm like, yo, where have I been? It's like, we've been trying to tell you, bro, for the last 2 years. All you had to do was come pull up. And so I went, you know, you sing the songs, you do the games, you hear the 10-minute talk. And I was just compelled by the environment, but Phil would not let up on his pursuit of me. And so he would constantly be like, yo, man, let's link up. I'll meet you at Dairy Queen. I'll come pick you up. Like, I'll be at your game. I'll come do whatever after practice. Let's go get a bite to eat after practice, whatever. And so the more and more I hung around Phil, and the longer I stayed around the Young Life Pocket, the more I got to see his life for real. And I saw how he navigated being a young married man. I saw him anticipate becoming a father. I saw him in how he interacted with his friends. I saw how he was as an employee. Like, I'm at his office watching him talk to his boss or his coworkers and plan and strategize. And I'm in all of the pockets of his life. I got to meet his parents. His parents paid for me to go to Young Life camp, unbeknownst to me. So all of these environments that I see Phil in, and I go, if that's what following Jesus is like, count me in. What do I do? And, you know, I'm not against praying prayers. He was like, look, I'm just going to walk with you in life. And I didn't know Christianese at that time. So I'm like, where are we going? Where's the destination? And he's like, no, by that I mean, I'm going to spend dedicated time with you to show you the way that this rabbi named Jesus is trying to communicate and invites us to participate in. So that was the linchpin. Phil Zahn, who I still talk to this day. Literally texted him last week. He'll be down here to do an event next month. And we went from strangers to mentor and mentee to friends to brothers. That's my brother. Yeah. And yeah, man.
Shout out to Phil.
Shout out to Phil. I call him Philly, man.
Phil. What do you mean bringing you to work? Like, what was he doing for a job?
He was as a Young Life area director, he would have, there was a Young Life area office, right? And he shared an office with his supervisor, and he would send emails. I'll just be in the office chilling with him as he's sending emails, as he's planning for certain things on a Monday night or for camp, doing campaigners, which is kind of like students who wanted to follow Jesus. We'd have Bible studies every Thursday. See, I saw all of it. I was like, okay, you just want me to come kick it with you at your office? And he's like, yeah. I'm like, okay, I'll come do that.
Sure. Do you have a sense of how many people Phil did that for?
I can name, it was myself. I can name Dave Lowe. I can name Jack. Those are the top two that come to my head.
Yeah.
But out of my peers, I know he was trying, but there wasn't reception, or not reception. There wasn't, what's it called? When you, reciprocation from a lot of my peers in the way that Phil would pursue. But those are the two that I can name off the top of my head of high school students that he was like, I'm not going to let you go. I don't care how far you go.
Right. So the reason I ask is, I mean, obviously he's doing gatherings. So he has a group. He has like a dozen people in his house. He's doing things at school where maybe he has 20 or 30 or 40 people. I don't know. He's doing camps where maybe you have 100 people. So like, there's always kind of, these larger circles and the smaller circles. And then he like my initial reaction hearing to what Phil did for you, I was like, man, Phil can't do that for very many people. Like Phil can't do one-on-one walk with a dozen people. You just, if he's going to be a husband and raise his child at the same time and hold a job, right? Like, so you had a very special gift in that.
I did.
But then also like, I just like to let you into what's going on under my own beanie. I'm just like, sometimes I use the idea that we can't do it for all people as an excuse to do it for no people. Like that's a struggle that I often have. Is I think metrically, I was like, if it's not a system, it's not good. And I'm like, but this, like, I mean, I don't know if Phil did this as a system or not, but whatever Phil did here, whatever he did for the few, had an impact, right? Like it has lasting impact, and so
absolutely,
that's something that I feel chastised and encouraged simultaneously by hearing about. Shout out to Phil.
Yeah, I mean, Phil inspired me to pursue youth. I was a youth pastor for, I would say I started in 2016 and stopped in 2020. So I was a youth pastor in particular for 4 years and then pastored in other ways outside of that. But Phil was a catalyst. I do not know where I would be if Phil did not approach me at that soccer game.
Hmm.
It's the same way if my mom didn't move us to Portland,
Right.
if Phil didn't approach me at that game,
Yeah.
Lord knows where Hakeem Bradley would be.
Yeah.
I know.
All these little steps along the way. So,
Indeed.
but you said like, I'm all for prayer or whatever, but like, so Phil was definitely the relationship, Christ in Phil, the hope of glory, is what helped make that a reality for you. But then do you remember, like, was there a day when you were like, dang, I guess I'm a Christian now? Like, or was it something that you looked back upon, you were like, oh, I guess I was a Christian 3 weeks ago. Like, how did that work for you?
Yeah. So we met, it was January of 2011. I remember this like it was yesterday. And at the time I had a Facebook, I said, Phil, he gave like a talk at a Young Life night prior to this. I think it was the Monday prior. And he's like, life's like a smoothie. And this is the short, truncated version. He's like, life's like a smoothie. I was like, you got my attention. He's like, and in this life, we put in ingredients that make our smoothies toxic. And Jesus doesn't want to take this smoothie and throw it away. He wants to take it and renew it so it can't be tainted anymore. And I was like, man, what do I do to get that smoothie? So I sent him a message on Facebook, said, dude, I need a new smoothie. And he's like, let's meet at Dairy Queen, which was literally maybe a couple dozen feet from my high school. So after school, I went over and we sat in that Dairy Queen, I want to say for about an hour and some change. And he's just talking to me about, okay, commitment to Jesus can look like this. And these are the practices that we participate in following Jesus. That's prayer, reading the scriptures, celebration, fasting, gathering with the believers in church, all of these things. And I was like, all right, cool. So like, what do I do though? And he's like, we'll start practicing these things together. And I think at that moment, I was like, all right, I think I'm in. I trust this to be true. I believe I want to trust in this man, Jesus, to renew my smoothie, so to speak.
I've heard a lot of analogies, whatever. That's a good one. The smoothie 106, smoothie 06.
Yeah. I was a big, in Portland, or at least in that space. I don't know how far it is across North America, but it was called Jamba Juice.
Yeah.
And I went to Jamba Juice every week in high school. So I was like, as soon as he said Jamba, I was like, I'm locked in, bro. I'm locked in. How do I get the new smoothie? And, you know, he didn't feel the need at the time to give me like all of the theological, but I didn't have categories for that.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't have known what it meant for this, or the significance of Christ's blood being shed, the resurrection, the ascension, the sending of the Spirit, his life. I had no idea, but he gave me enough to give me a foundation to say, all right, let's build on top of that.
That's
and
great.
So we read the scriptures every Thursday together at 6 a.m. before school. Every Thursday. Oh, yeah.
That's commitment.
Indeed.
You're like a high school swimmer at that.
Woo!
So there you go. And then somehow, over sounds like a 4 or 5 year period, you go from being somebody who is just kind of getting to know Jesus and walking through that faith to being somebody who's a youth pastor. Did you, was kind of Bible college a part of that trajectory at all? No, okay.
No,
You're just like, I'm going to learn on the job, OJT, as they say, on the job training.
So to speak,
yeah.
I went to undergrad for business. I'm like, business can apply to anything. I think we can make that work. So as I was getting a business degree, it was my senior year or my last year of university. As
we do that. We know senior year. The rest of we start saying sophomore and freshman, people get a little bit.
They're like, what?
Yeah.
So it was my senior year of university, and I think it was October. I get a phone call randomly from this guy named Eric Knox. Now, this is another catalyst. So my mom, Phil, Eric Knox. Eric Knox gives me a call.
Don't forget your elementary school teacher. I forget her name now. But that one
Mrs.
too. Don't
Yep, my mom, Mrs. McLaughlin.
Okay. There you go. Okay. I'm tracking. Okay.
You're correct.
So we got Knox. All right.
So Knox calls me, and I think it's a LA number. So I'm like, I don't know nobody from LA. Like, who's calling? So I ignore it, and then I get a voicemail. Yo, Hakeem, this is Eric Knox. man, I got a job opportunity potentially, if you're interested, of becoming a youth pastor at this church plant that we're doing for Imago Dei community. And I was like, oh, snap, let me call him back. So I called him on the phone. I met Eric 2 years prior to this, and just on one occasion. And so for him to call me and then offer me a job, I was like, what the heck? And so he calls me, I call him back, and we get to chit chat, and he's like, yeah, man, we're doing this part-time kind of like youth pastor intern, if you're interested. And I was like, all right, bet. Let's see what this is about. Mark, when I tell you, I had no idea what I was doing. But at the same time, there was a freshness to that I wish I was able to maintain throughout my time in pastoral ministry, and a willingness to, I think I've always been willing to learn, but a willingness to not be comfortable. I was always trying new things, especially in the first year of me trying to pastor these youth. And those kids taught me a lot. And to this day, I still talk to many of them. They're doing well. Some of them are in college. Some of them have graduated. Some of them are doing very, very well for themselves. And others are trying to figure out what is it like to be a young adult in this world. And so all that to say, that was the transition. And so I didn't go to seminary until I was in my mid-20s. I was like, all right, I think I should probably get a degree at this.
Right.
But that wasn't for pastoral ministry. It was because I really wanted to pursue biblical scholarship. And so all that, we could get there in just a minute, but that's kind of how the trajectory kind of shifted. And my love for the scriptures grew as I was graduating high school. And I'm like, all right, this book is weird, or these books are really weird, right? Like, you get to chapter 3, you start talking about talking snakes. I'm like, I don't have a category for that. What's going on here?
Yeah.
But I kept going. I said, I'm going to read through this entire thing. And I just took it slowly. I read commentaries. I listened to sermons. I was just digesting. And Leviticus was rough to get through. Numbers was rough to get through. Deuteronomy was rough to get through. Joshua was a hard read, but I just kept going. And over time, I just fell in love with this literature. And I wanted to communicate that and communicate the wisdom that I've been learning to the youth I was pastoring, but also to a broader audience. And I just didn't know how to do that. So I just said, okay, I'll just do it at this youth ministry for now.
So you're reading a little bit with Phil on Thursday mornings, but you're also reading on your own time, whatever. You say you got no categories for it. Did you grow up reading the Quran? Like, was that something that you actually, or you would hear snippets of it, but it wasn't like you were doing daily readings or anything?
Yeah,
like that yourself?
I was not doing daily readings at all. Yeah. I would rarely hear snippets.
Okay.
Rarely. If anything, I barely heard literature from the faith I grew up in.
Okay.
Because 5%ers, it's interesting because traditional Muslims, whether Shia or Sunni, they would not consider 5%ers as Muslims. And so, but the 5%ers are like, no, we are Muslims. And it's a whole thing. So your text, you also would look at the writings of the Prophet Elijah Muhammad, quote unquote, and then you would look at Quran sometimes, and there were other supplemental things that people would write. Things of Clarence 13X, I believe, wrote a couple things. I have some of the documents stored in my Google Drive as we speak. Just to, if I'm in dialogues, I'm like, hey, this is why I don't believe these things. Let me point them out.
Right.
So yeah, I didn't read Quran at all, really.
Right. The Bible is a weird text. I mean, the reason I only bring that up is because almost all, if it's truly a religious text, it's also a weird text. Like, there's not a lot of I don't know. I haven't read through the Christian Science manual, but I guarantee it's weird. Like, I think all these texts are weird. The Bible is really weird. So you fall in love with it, and I mentioned on the job training earlier. Like, I didn't take a lot of post-secondary until, like you, as I'm in mid-20s, and then I didn't take any pastoral training until I was a pastor. Yeah. And I remember I didn't love school, but I remember, loving taking these courses. I was taking night courses or whatever, because I learned something on Monday night, and then I would use it on Tuesday morning. Like, there was almost no distance at all between the information that was coming in and its application. And I was like, oh, I like this. I love learning about something and then being able to immediately use it rather than have it kind of sit on the back of my brain like arithmetic or whatever that I feel like I never use, even though I probably do.
Yep.
But yeah, so
Yep.
I wonder if that's, that sparks part of your love for the text, because you're able to, as you're learning it, you're able to teach it because you have an outlet for it in your students. And then what is it that goes, so you mentioned that you went to seminary. Where did you go to seminary?
I went to Western Seminary in Portland, Oregon.
Yes. What are some names there? Is that where does Nijay Gupta teach there?
No, Nijay was at Portland Seminary, which is at George Fox University. But I met Nijay while I was in seminary at Western.
Okay.
Have you heard of the name Gary Bashirs?
I've heard the name, but I don't know much of the work.
Gary is the reason I went to Western. He is kind of just like the pastor of pastors in not only the Pacific Northwest, but just like low key across America. He knows some folks who really look to him pastorally. Just this old guy named Gary, who's a faithful follower of Christ, and he invited me to join his cohort. And so Western has a couple cohorts that you can do courses through. And it was a 2-year cohort of a bunch of pastors or ministry leaders of some kind. We would get together once a month, do an all-day class, like from 9 to 5. And then in between that, you could take courses on the side to fulfill a degree. But mainly the cohort is the reason I stayed in seminary. It is the reason. The relationships I had in that space was awesome. And some of my coworkers that I was working at a different church, I was a young adults pastor at this time, they also were going to school with me in that cohort as well. And so that gave me more motivation to pursue it. But Gary is the reason I think we all pushed through. And he's still rocking out. I think he's planning on retiring, but he's such a cool dude.
Gary Bashirs.
I call him G Boogie. He loves it.
That's a good nickname.
Yeah,
we should all be so lucky. So you go through that, and some people are like, "Poof, seminary, cemetery. I never intend to go that route again." But you're like, "I actually want to take a doctorate." Is that right? Like, so how? What? Yeah. So, I'm always interested in people who end up kind of going that route. And so, how much gap is there between your kind of graduation with your seminary degree and when you actually enroll in doctoral studies?
I think it was a year. I think it was a year total. And yeah, part of the motivation was because I want to reach people that come from the background that I do. And there are a lot of folks who have skepticism about this faith that I now ascribe to. A lot of people think it's the white man's religion. And I do not think that's true by any means necessary. And there are reasons why I understand how people come to that conclusion. I understand because I used to think the same stuff. And there was a moment where I even doubted faith, even in my mid-20s while I was in seminary. I'm like, wait, everything I'm reading is from one perspective. Like, is this a white man's religion? Like, I ain't reading nothing from Asian theologians or from Latino, da-da-da-da. But nonetheless, I said, if I don't go do this work, who will? From my specific background in where I come from in Philadelphia, I said, who are my cousins going to listen to? They're not going to listen to a podcast, 2 Bible folks talking. They're not going to go to seminary. They're not going to do X, Y, and Z for a variety of reasons. So I'll go do it so that I can bring what I'm learning back home, and I'll be able to contextualize it and culturally translate. That's a necessity. If I can't take everything and say it how it would be applied in Portland and take that to Philadelphia or to Atlanta, I have to translate it and say, there's some truths out here, but here's subjectively how I have to say it so that it lands. It lands differently. So yeah, it was just a year gap though. It was a long answer just to say that. No,
that's what I want to get to though. So like, do you feel like that's your mission? Is
Absolutely.
You have like, I must go back to the people from whence I came in some respects. Like you want to carry this message back to places like, or particularly like Philadelphia.
Sure.
Have you started to experiment with that kind of enculturation now, like taking those kind of objective things and saying them subjectively? How's that been looking?
It's been a couple things. One, I try to say a couple things on social media every now and again. And when I go out and share, whether I'm invited to a conference or to a church, I'm always talking about my background. And if there are folks who come from a similar background, typically I'll get approached and we have a conversation. But then outside of that, I have friends here in Atlanta friends across the country that I talk with and strategize with, like, yo, how can I be a resource to you and your community? How can I participate in making quote unquote ivory tower conversations in biblical scholarship and bring that to the land? Like, how can I do that for you? And those are kind of the ways right now. Still trying to figure it out. Got a couple plans for 2025 that I can't divulge currently, but I think it'll be very fun with some fun friends.
That's good.
Yeah, it'd be very fun.
So why Atlanta? What brought you from Portland to Atlanta?
So be honest, man, I miss the black people.
You're like, I seen enough lattes and like bougie donut shops to last me a long time.
I said I miss being around black folks. It's like Wakanda out here. If you've seen Black Panther, I mean, the vibranium is everywhere. So that was a motivation. And having 2 kids, I kind of wanted my kids just to kind of grow up in an environment where their cultural background would be affirmed more often, in addition to others being affirmed as well.
Right.
But one of the main motivations was also financial. I was like, I want to buy my family a house, and I can't afford to do that here in Portland. And so Atlanta provided that. And lastly, we had a phenomenal group of friends already down here.
Oh.
And so when we came down, it was kind of not starting from scratch, but starting from at least like level 2 and building a foundation here.
That's great.
So
That's
those were the motivations.
That's great. But you're not, your doctoral path has taken you not to the east coast of Canada, but to the land down under. Is that right? You're taking it through, is it through Ridley College?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
But do you have to spend much time in Australia, or do you go there like once a year or a couple times?
Yeah. There's an option to, we have a conference called ResCon every year. And that's typically when students, whether distant or living in Melbourne, will go out there for the conference. And so I haven't been able to go yet. I just finished my 2nd year. So my 3rd year of my program starts in February. But I plan to go next August. That's like my utmost goal.
And are you in like, is it class sessions? So you're actually taking like classes, or is it just like, here's a boatload of books, man, just read these books? It's like mostly, you're not in dissertation mode, obviously, yet, are you? Or
no, I'm writing my dissertation as we speak.
Okay,
so
you're already there. All right.
Yeah, I finished my first chapter, and I have a total of 5 that I'm projecting to do. So I'm working on my 2nd currently. And I could finish anywhere from the next 2 to 3 years. I have up to 6 because I'm a part-time student. But generally, you have more than enough time for what I'm trying to do. I'm like, I think I have more. 6 years is a long time. I think I have more than enough.
Shoot,
we'll
that's
see.
a long time for sure.
Yeah, we'll see.
Who's your direct supervisor?
His name is Brian Rosner. And the funny thing is, culturally, they go, because I used to be like, man, Dr. Rosner, such and such. He's like, don't call me that. Just call me Brian. He's like, that's an American thing. You guys love your titles. He's like, we're fine. Just call me Brian. I was like, okay, I got you.
Do you find that true? I find that nobody uses titles anymore. Like my kid, none of my kids, their friends ever call me Mr. Jolliker. And what? I'd say, go ahead and do that, man. You call me Mr. whatever you want at this point in time.
Yeah. I think it depends on who. I think it depends on who it is and where you are. So I know in some spaces, if you don't call a professor Dr. such and such, they will have a significant problem.
I'm a part-time professor at a university, and I tell you what, I mean, I think the struggle is real. Most people at this point in time, I think we're culturally conditioned, at least in my neck of the woods, to say, just call me Mark.
Yeah.
Professor Jolliker was my dad, if he was a university professor, which he isn't. But I'm like, in some respects, I'm like, I kind of feel like there's a race to the bottom here with like, I'm like, it's okay to have some respect paid to people. Anyway, that's not what we're going to talk about. But, so you've got a doctor who's your guy. You call him by his first name. That's great. So what is your actual, like, so what is, I'm fascinated by this. And this is where at some point in time, we're going to be like, oh, and now I'm tricking up from this conversation. But I think you'll make it sound sassy. What is your thesis? Like, what are you actually driving at?
My thesis is currently that James is alluding to the narratives of Genesis 1 through 11 to bolster his arguments to care for the poor to seek God's wisdom and to endure testing of faith. And each of those narratives are kind of drawing on, fundamentally, I think Genesis 1 through 11 is about loving God and neighbor. Like what is the garden story except for one's allegiance to God being fractured? And then also the allegiance to one another being fractured. And then what is the Cain and Abel story? It's about the shattered relationship between brothers, failure to love one's neighbor as yourself, and so on and so forth, right? So all that to say, I think James is using those narratives, and it's not really investigated too much on how influential that section of Genesis is. And also, I work at an organization where Genesis is the thing that we talk about. So that was a major influence. But I'm really compelled by the Epistle of James as much as I am of the scroll of Genesis as a whole. And I think if you can read the first 11 chapters of Genesis, you can read the rest of the scriptures. It gives you all of the categories, and it gives you the story ahead of time.
Right.
And so I'm trying to investigate that in James, because I think those narratives are alluded to throughout the New Testament.
Sure.
Gospels, Acts, Paul, Peter, John, Jude, Revelation, all of that is picking up on these narratives, all of it.
Interesting. Yeah. I look forward to reading that when that's available.
Thank you.
Very cool. That's great. So you also alluded to the fact that you work at another place. That place is the Bible Project. Is that right? Okay.
That is true. They pay the bills.
They do. And they do more than Genesis. I know that's true. Our church actually works through, we've been through the year in the Bible in a year on YouVersion, and we've used the Bible Project as the kind of backbone for that for the last couple of years. Those
That's
videos
awesome.
are just, so what do you specifically do with the Bible Project?
I work on our scholarship team doing research and writing. So for a lot of forms of content that get produced, I'm behind the scenes reading books and trying to synthesize and then helping to write scripts or copy media that's on a website or something like that. So it changes from year to year on the type of content that we're developing. So it's always fun, but foundationally it's research and writing.
How big is the team? I mean, yeah, it's funny. It's like, you see this, you see or hear these two guys, but I mean, I know now that they've got classes that they're offering. So obviously there's a lot more on the go. So if you had to guess, what's the size of the Bible Project team at this point?
Yeah, overall, if you're just talking about employees and not contractors, I would say it's about 130 or so, 140.
Come on.
It's pretty significant.
That's significant indeed. Yeah, that's a big number, man. I would never have guessed that. That's huge. Yeah.
And I think if I recall correctly, we have 7 departments. Of course, we have 7 departments, right? Of course.
That's holy.
Mine is one of those departments. And so you have marketing, product, finance, tech, scholarship, HR. And I feel like I'm missing one. Oh, and people. Nope. Yeah, I think I'm missing one. But in that gist, I think it makes up about 140 or so.
Wow, that's huge.
Yeah,
it goes to show you, like, sometimes, literally on the drive before I came here, I picked up my daughter from school, and she asked, she said, "How long does it take to make a song?" Is what she said. Make a song, and I was like, "You're gonna have to be more specific." I was like, "What do you mean?" It's like, do you mean write a song? Do you mean record a song? Do you want to do it with an acoustic guitar on your voice? Do you want to have like an 18-part backing choir with it? Like, what do you mean when you say make a song? I'm just thinking about those videos. Like, it's like, 3-minute video that kind of rolls across your YouTube screen that explains, I don't know, holiness or whatever. For the layperson. It's like, oh, it's so ephemeral. For some people, it's like, oh, well, that was 3 minutes. It's gone. It's like, that could have been like 100 hours of research and writing and editing and production and post-production, and like somebody had to master that sound, baby. Like all the stuff that goes into it. It's like
it's a lot.
It's a lot. But they're such incredibly powerful tools that have been used a lot. And I feel like I saw something recently online that suggests that maybe you were doing some work with the great John Mark Comer recently. Is this correct?
Oh, yeah. John Mark is a friend of mine, and of Tim's. And so we got to participate in doing, I think they'll drop in January, we did like a very long conversation with him, and one of our coworkers, Dr. Brittany Kim, joined as well. And we did like a long conversation that'll get split up into multiple episodes.
Mm-hmm.
And then Brittany and I did some sideline like testimonial stuff, talking about engaging the scriptures. So that'll be fun to see the final product of that.
Is that for practicing the way, or is that in the Bible Project? Is that okay?
Yeah, practicing the way. We filmed it at the Bible Project offices, right where Classroom is filmed now, currently. Yeah. So that was real fun. Very fun.
It's fresh. It's nice.
Yeah, yes, indeed.
Well, listen, before we go, I want to ask 2 questions. One will be just like, hey, tell me more about what's going on. We can follow you, whatever. But you allude to the idea, and you said this about 5 minutes ago, that part of your kind of apologetic to people is like, hey, Christianity isn't the white man's religion. I'm always so confused by that, because we know that Jesus wasn't white, and we know that the early apostles weren't white. So what is it that makes that a popular argument for people?
Sure. Yeah, not to minimize it too much or to be reductionistic, I think some would argue the last 500 years of church history has been dominated by Europe. And with colonialization and the spread of Christianity, in addition to colonialism, kind of gives this notion that without Europeans, many people of color around the world, especially in Africa, wouldn't have come to faith, or wouldn't trust in this Jesus thing, or if the transatlantic slave trade wouldn't have happened, a bunch of folks in America, a bunch of Black folks in America wouldn't be Christian. Their ancestors were doing traditional African spiritualities, or were into Islam, or what have you. And so those are some of the main arguments I would hear from my respective community. But mainly I think it's just church history. A lot of folks have an issue with some of the ups and downs throughout church history, that folks will go, Europe has too much of a strong hand in this for it to be a faith that is beneficial for more than just Europeans. And so I literally listened to a debate like 2 nights ago talk about this very thing. And it is prevalent within Black communities, folks who say this is a white man's religion, folks going, that's a fallacious argument, and here's why. And I don't see that tension being resolved anytime soon. But I'm just glad there are folks who are willing to contend that this Jewish rabbi from the 1st century is trustworthy. And yes, there are ugly things that have happened in church history across the world, across ethnicities, all of that. But that doesn't negate that this rabbi is truly trustworthy if we're willing to recenter and continually center ourselves upon his teachings and his person. And so, yeah, it's a lot. I don't want to be too reductionistic, but I think those are 2 big things that folks would kind of argue for.
Yeah. So and you mentioned that even when you were, pursuing this more deeply at a university, seminary, you were like, oh wait, but why am I reading only from white folks, whoever? So have you found a way, I mean, obviously you know where you're going with this, but on the way, have you found is there a hack for people who are who kind of all of a sudden come alive to this themselves? They're like, oh yeah, you're right. And so I feel like we're kind of in our day and age, in this particular cultural moment, to evoke the specter of John Mark one more time. There is this kind of some people, I put myself in this camp. I don't want to be quote unquote woke, because I'm I feel like there's some negativity to that. And I think that some of that negativity is actually founded, not all of it, but I feel like some of it is there's this kind of Marxist or neo-Marxist, whatever, that it just is to say it the second time in the same conversation, a race to the bottom in some respects that I feel like is going to actually be bad for us. But I don't think that it's deniable that we are essentially we've dominated the output of theology has been dominated by the white perspective. And so I'm affirmative action may not be the way, or DEI may not be the way to fix it, but there has to be a way to fix it. There has to be a way to help. And so what can a guy or gal do you, if they're just like, should I just randomly pick some books? Should I find a reading list online? Like how can you help people with this, in a word, conundrum?
Yeah, I mean, I do think we have to recognize that co-opting is a big issue. And what I mean by that is, like, even with the term woke, I'm like, I remember that being specifically, at least, or originated in Black communities, to be like, man,
You need to wake up.
you need to wake up, to go like, yo, look around, be attentive, be aware. And then that word became something that wasn't intended, and yada yada yada. So you got that, but at the same time, theologically and biblically, at least studies wise, there's been co-opting, and some cultural perspectives become dominant as if it's the original. And I'm not saying that's just the case with Europeans, I'm just saying in general. So I would advise folks like, yo, read early church Christians. Read them.
Yeah.
You will see they think very differently than a bunch of us. And you'll be surprised that a lot of them come from Northern Africa. You'll be surprised that a lot of them come from Asia Minor. You'll be surprised that a lot of them don't come from Europe. And it's no shot to Europeans at all. But there's so much of Christian theology that is influenced by early African Christianity, especially in Egypt, and other places as well. But church history is too broad for us to reduce it to just one slice of the pie, whether that's different traditions in Africa, in Europe, in Asia, or where else. But I would just say, read. I got a couple resources. I know there's some hot water around this scholar right now, but I do think this book is phenomenal.
Is it Vince?
Yeah, it's called the title is A Multitude of All Peoples, by Dr. Vince Bantu. That book gives so much church history, and it's just scratching the surface. But yeah, read the Apostolic Fathers. Read a bunch of anti-Nicene fathers. Read some of the Nicene fathers, the folks who were like Athanasius. Dude was called the Black Dwarf. I'm like, does that mean he was chocolate? I'm assuming so. Dude's from Africa. He could be browner skin. And again, I'm not trying to elevate one's pigmentation in skin, but I'm just saying the church historically is multi-ethnic and multicultural. It's just what it is.
Yeah.
And if you just read the New Testament, you have to realize these are first century Jewish folks. That's not anyways, I'm just saying those are a couple things I would encourage somebody to do. And that was what was helpful for me when I started to read these early Christian writers, or just the testimonies of even church mothers, those who've been persecuted. I'm like, where are they from?
Yeah.
Oh, you're from such and so. You're from Libya. You're from there. Oh, people of color been a part of this the whole time. And they have resources, that I can read. And there are modern people as well. One of my favorites is Esau McCulley. Dude is a Pauline scholar who's a genius. And I drip from everything he's putting out there. So I'm saying a lot, trying to say a little, but those are just a couple of things I would say.
That's great. I've been really intending to read Reading While Black. I've been thinking about it for a long time, and so maybe this conversation will be the one that will finally add it to my Amazon queue. We'll see.
Come on.
While I'm waiting for your book to come out, of course. Hakeem, this has been this has been good. I mean, we could go down any other number of rabbit trails, but we won't. We'll save that for a later date next time I'm in Atlanta. If people want to follow along with your journey, I know that you've got an Instagram that you're semi-active on. Is that kind of the best locale for you?
Yeah, that or that's probably the best. If you want to be like, what is Hakeem doing today? I might show a burger. I might show me playing with my kids, or I might have something that I'm meditating on that I just want to share from time in the scripture or in conversations with friends, or my website. That's pretty much the two things.
What's your website address?
HakeemBradley.com.
That makes sense. That does. That tracks.
It's my name, Yeah.
As the British would say, it does what it says on the tin. So it's explicit. Okay, hey, listen, Hakeem, this is really great for me. I really appreciate your time. And
thanks for having me, man.
I'm just looking forward to seeing even more about how God's going to use you and more of these catalysts in your life. And, it'd be interesting if we could somehow, this is the thing that we never get to do, if we could extrapolate out and find out who you were a catalyst for, right? The kind of stories that people are telling about you. I think that'd be a pretty interesting time, but that'll be sometime in eternity. So,
indeed. Praise God for that.